Alrighty, pull out history. We're on page 141, chapter 15. Pause if you need to get there. I'm going to start to read. So, A New World in Conflict. War against the Colonies. King Philip's War. Also, please follow along. While the kings of Europe fought and schemed to make their kingdoms larger, the English colonies in North America were growing larger all on their own. More and more men and women were making the long journey across the Atlantic Ocean. New settlements spread across Massachusetts, over into the land we now call Rhode Island and Connecticut. New settlers built more houses, cleared more fields, and chopped down more trees. They needed more space, and so they kept moving further west and further into Native American lands until the Wampanoag tribe decided to fight back. At first, the Wampanoag and the English had been friends. When the English settlers first came to Massachusetts, the Wampanoag showed them how to fish, how to trap game, and how to survive the harsh northern winters. But as the Massachusetts colony grew larger, the colonists no longer needed the Wampanoag. They grew their own crops and traded their own goods to European merchant ships in exchange for the salt, weapons, and seeds that they needed. And they forced the Wampanoag to give them land for their growing town. The king of the Wampanoag tribe, Metacom, saw that his kingdom was vanishing. When his people went to fish in their favorite streams, the banks were crowded with colonists. When they walked in their hunting grounds, English hunters lurked behind trees, waiting for deer. "I am resolved," Metacom announced to a friend, "that I will not see the day when I have no kingdom." One cold January morning, a young Wampanoag man left his tiny village and hurried down the icy road toward Plymouth Bay. He had grown up in Metacom's kingdom, but in his teens, he had gone to the new little college built by the English to train Christian ministers. At this little college, which the English called Harvard, the Wampanoag boy had been given the English name John Sassaman. John Sassaman knew Metacom well. Because John could read and write in English, Metacom had often asked him to carry messages to the English leaders. But now John Sassaman carried a warning. John walked for hours, shivering in the gray winter air. His feet grew numb with cold. Finally, the tall wooden walls of the Plymouth fortress came into view. John Sassaman hurried through the gates. "Where's the governor?" he asked. "I must speak to him right away." The governor of Plymouth, Josiah Winslow, was busy with paperwork. But John Sassaman waited, anxiously glancing back at Plymouth's strong walls. When he was finally brought into the governor's office, he spoke so quickly that Winslow could barely understand it. "King Metacom is raising an army," he blurted out. "He's asking every other tribe to join with him to fight against you. He plans to drive the English back to their home. I've come to warn you, but please, please don't send me back. He doesn't know I'm here, and if the warriors find out that I've warned you, they'll kill me." Winslow sighed. Like many English, he thought that the Wampanoag were stupid and not to be trusted. "You can hardly believe an Indian," he remarked to a friend, "even when they tell the truth." He turned to John Sassaman. "Go back home," he said. "Plymouth Plantation is safe." Sassaman pleaded to stay, but Winslow refused. When Sassaman left the fortress, his eyes were filled with tears. A week later, John Sassaman disappeared. His body was found, frozen into the ice of a pond. His neck was broken. Josiah Winslow and the Plymouth plantation leaders took alarm. Perhaps Sassaman's fears had been real. When two men came forward claiming that they had seen 3 Wampanoag warriors kill Sassaman and throw him into the pond, the English decided to show Metacom who was really in charge of Massachusetts. English soldiers arrested the warriors and brought them to Plymouth. The Wampanoag warriors were tried, convicted of murder, and executed. Metacom was furious. How dared the English invade his village and drag away his warriors? 3 days after the execution, Metacom and his men attacked the little Plymouth settlement, burning houses and driving the settlers away. War had begun. The war between the English and the Wampanoag dragged on for months. The colonists had more guns, but the Native Americans were better at surprise attacks and ambushes. And Metacom convinced other Native American tribes nearby to join with him in his war against the English. Native American warriors burned English settlements, killed English colonists, and took others captive, only releasing them in exchange for money and weapons. One of these captured women, Mary Rowlandson, wrote about the attack on her house. "It was the dolefullest day that ever mine eyes saw," she lamented. "From all places the Indians shot against the house so that the bullets seemed to fly like hail. Some in our house were fighting for their lives, others wallowing in their blood, the house on fire over our heads. Then I took my children, to go forth and leave the house. But as soon as we came to the door and appeared, the Indians shot so thick that the bullets rattled against the house, as if one had taken a handful of stones and threw them." Mary and her children were captured and held prisoner for weeks, until her husband paid money for her release. After 8 months of war, 1,300 Englishmen from Plymouth banded together to make the strongest attack yet against Metacom's forces. Metacom and his warriors had joined together with another tribe, the Narragansett, and were camped out in the middle of a treacherous swamp. The Englishmen sloshed through the swamp and attacked Metacom's camp. The battle, which became known as the Great Swamp Fight, almost wiped out the Native American warriors. Metacom himself fled west into the colony of New York and tried to convince the Mohawk tribe to give him fresh warriors and weapons. When the Mohawks refused, Metacom tried to keep on fighting with his remaining men, but his shrinking war band could not resist forever. 8 months after the Great Swamp Fight, English soldiers surrounded Metacom's camp. Metacom escaped, but his wife and 9-year-old son were captured and sold as slaves to South America. Metacom evaded the English for 10 more days, but was surrounded in the middle of a swamp, unable to get away. A Native American warrior who had joined the English forces shot Metacom. The English then cut off his head, paraded back to Plymouth in triumph, and put Metacom's head on a pole in the middle of the settlement, where it remained for years. Because the English called Metacom King Philip, this war became known as King Philip's War. 12 English towns had been burned to the ground. 1 out of every 16 men had died. Crops had been destroyed and farms leveled. In the following winters, many colonists died of starvation. But more than 3,000 Native Americans had died as well. Whole villages had been burned. Entire tribes had been killed. The few remaining members of those tribes scattered, many fleeing to the north. Now the English could continue to spread across North America, across land left empty by King Philip's War. Okay. Then I go on to the next heading. This video should have time, so let's continue. War against the colonies. Louis XVI saves New France. Nope, that's Louis XIV. Louis XIV saves New France. I thought we had already talked about Louis XIV. Up north of Massachusetts, the French colonies were also fighting with Native American enemies. The people of New France had done their best to be friends with the Native Americans nearby. Years before, Samuel Champlain had been careful to make friends with the nearest tribe, the Hurons. He gave them presents, slept and ate in their villages, and helped them fight against their enemies. But the Hurons suffered from this friendship. The French gave the Hurons presents, but they also passed along a terrible new disease called smallpox. The Hurons had never been near smallpox before, so their bodies couldn't recognize the germs and fight them off. They began to grow ill. Rashes spread across their faces. They had trouble breathing and swallowing. Over half of the Huron tribe died from smallpox. Another Native American tribe that lived nearby, the Iroquois, saw that the Hurons had become weak from illness. The Iroquois had always been more warlike than the Hurons, so Iroquois armies invaded Huron land, burned Huron camps and longhouses, and killed hundreds of Huron men and women. The Huron tribe disintegrated, and the triumphant Iroquois claimed their land. Then the Iroquois set out to destroy New France, because the French had been friends and allies of the Hurons. Small parties of Iroquois warriors raided farms in Quebec, burning houses and killing settlers. Other war bands laid siege to Montreal, the largest settlement in New France. The settlers fought back, but the fierce and determined Iroquois were experts at forest fighting. They appeared and disappeared with bewildering speed, leaving death and destruction behind them. The attacks went on and on. More and more French settlers left the dangerous lands of New France and went home. The colony shrank until it had almost disappeared. But then the King of France, Louis XIV, stepped in to rescue New France. Louis XIV, the Sun King, had spent years fighting wars to expand his French empire. He didn't intend to lose his colonies in the New World, so he sent soldiers from the French army over to fight the Iroquois. He promised these soldiers that he would give them land in the New World if they would save New France. The French soldiers sailed to New France and marched off their ship ready to fight. They had muskets and cannons. They had already fought bloody wars on the battlefields of Europe, and they were sure that they could defeat the savages of North America. They were wrong. The battlefields of Europe hadn't prepared them to fight in the thick and tangled brush. Even with their bullets and cannonballs, the French soldiers weren't able to defeat the Iroquois nation. But they did manage to protect the settlements of New France from attack. Finally, the Iroquois agreed to observe an uneasy peace. They retreated back to their own land, and the French soldiers settled down on their new land, ready to begin new lives. Now they were faced with a different problem. Louis XIV had sent hundreds of soldiers, all men, to New France. These soldiers wanted to start families and raise lots of little French Canadians. But there were 6 men for every woman in New France. Once more, Louis XIV came to the rescue. He announced that he would pay young French women large amounts of money if they would go and live in the colonies. Many young women accepted the king's offer and sailed across the Atlantic to New France, where they were greeted with great joy by French soldiers looking for wives. These young women became known as filles du roi, or daughters of the king. Now that New France was a safer place to live, the colony began to grow once again. Farmers, called habitants, cultivated the fields of the New World. Fur traders, called voyageurs, sailed up and down the rivers, trading for furs. Ships from France came to the ports of New France, bringing French goods, newspapers, and more settlers. The towns of Quebec and Montreal grew larger and richer. The streets were laid with cobbles. Stone houses stood proudly in the middle of each town. Silversmiths, wig makers, and tailors worked hard on their crafts. The gentlemen and ladies of New France, like the courtiers of Louis XIV over in France, decked themselves with silk, lace, powder wigs, and jewelry. But the Iroquois had not given up. Once again, they began to attack the rich towns and farms of New France. One October morning, the farm of Francois and Jerry lay peacefully under the mellow fall sun. Francois was a seigneur, an army officer who had been rewarded with a large farm. His farm was called Verchères. Many farmers lived on the lands of Verchères, cultivating his fields for him. On this particular morning, Francois and his wife were both away from the fort, tending to business in the nearby town. Their 14-year-old daughter, Marie Madeleine, was walking through the fields. She could just see the fort in the distance. Birds sang in the trees nearby, and the cool fall air moved against her face. Suddenly, Marie Madeleine heard gunshots in the distance. Then she heard a terrifying sound, the voices of farmers screaming, "Save yourselves! The Iroquois are attacking!" She turned and saw a band of 50 Iroquois warriors charging toward her. She ran toward the fort as fast as she could. Later, Madeleine wrote down the events of that day. This is a simpler version of her story. I'm going to pause there because I'm about to run out of time. We'll pick back